The slopes of Rome's capital hill, the Campidoglio, were once resplendent with Rome's most important temples. Today rises the white-stoned edifice known to Italians as l'Altare della Patria, the altar of the fatherland. Symbol of the unification of Italy, construction was begun at the end of the last century. The cost to us in archaeological losses was high. An entire medieval quarter was cleared away. Nevertheless, it serves today as a reminder of how the marble must have looked, which once covered all of Rome's buildings and monuments. The Fori Imperiali, the Roman courthouses and administrative center, were begun by Caesar at the side of the Foro Romano, already inadequate for a city that had become known as the capital of the world. Via dei Fori Imperiali leads to the Colosseum, the magnificent amphitheater built by the emperors of the Flavia family in the 100 years after Christ. It has become the symbol of Rome. The Church of Santa Maria in Araceli soars aloft atop the peak of the Campidoglio, where once stood the temple of Giunone Moneta. The Michelangelo steps rise like a mountain road to the Piazza del Campidoglio, Michelangelo's Piazza. Alongside the altar of the fatherland is the Caesar Forum, a long colonnaded piazza whose focal point was the temple of the Venus known as Venere Genitrici. It was once richly decorated with works of art, notably a collection of paintings from the most famous of Greek artists. Under the foundations of the little church of St. Joseph the Carpenter, we can still find the remains of the Roman prison, Il Carcere Mamertino e Tullianum, where enemies of the state were put to death. It was here that the martyrs Peter and Paul awaited execution. Amongst the ruins of the Roman Forum, we can make out the triumphal arches celebrating the Roman conquests. That of Settimio Severo, between the Rostri and La Curia, with its beautiful proportions, and the fornix remaining of the Arch of Tito. The Roman Forum was the center of politics, religion, and commerce in the city. It was here that Rome's destiny was decided by rulers such as Sylla, Cicero, Julius Caesar, and Augustus. The Colosseum is perhaps so called for the colossal statue of Nero, which sprung up in its neighborhood. However, its more exact description is the Flavian amphitheater, since its construction was begun in the year 72 AD by a certain Vespasiano of the Flavia family. It was inaugurated 8 years later by his son Titus with great celebrations. The entire area of the amphitheater was covered with a floor of wooden sections which hid from view all the backstage equipment, the machinery, the weapons, and the cages for the wild beasts. The spectators were protected from the wild beasts by a substantial net, and from the sun by a vast cloth awning, which could be drawn over their heads by 100 sailors from the port of Miseno. The Romans paid great attention to the care and cleanliness of their bodies and built grandiose bathhouses, highly decorated with mosaics and precious marbles. In the city of Rome, no less than 14 aqueducts supplied water to the 11 public baths, to some 900 private baths, and about 2,000 fountains. An ingenious system of terracotta pipes behind their walls connected to boilers which provided a hot air system of central heating. The baths were generally divided into 3 areas: il frigidarium, with its huge swimming pool, il tepidarium, which, as its name suggests, consisted of basins of tepid water, and il calidarium, which provided hot baths and even saunas. In the center of Piazza Argentina are to be seen the remains of the sacred area of Campo Marzio, with its 4 temples of the Republican era. The first temple to the right is from 3 centuries before Christ and has undergone various restorations. There is some doubt over its dedication, whether to Giunione Curitis or to Giuturna. At any rate, it was transformed in the Middle Ages into the little church of San Nicola di Calcario. A huge podium fashioned out of blocks of tufa rock is all that remains of Pompey's tribunal. It was here on the Ides of March, 44 years before the birth of Christ, that Caius Julius Caesar was assassinated by young noblemen and senators who had plotted against him. He fell, covering his face with his toga, at the pedestal of Pompey's statue, his old rival, covering it with his blood. The Pantheon is the best preserved of the Roman monuments. One is awestruck by its grandiosity, its harmony, its originality of construction. It was begun by Agrippa a century before Christ to adorn Campo Marzio with a temple to all the gods. The Pantheon of today, however, dates from the time of Adriano. "16 enormous granite columns plunge into the foundations of this monument, which houses the tombs of Raffaello, Annibale Carracci, Baldassare Peruzzi, Taddeo Zuccari, and Vignola, all of them famous painters and most of them outstanding architects. A 20 feet thick cylindrical wall, alleviated by 8 niches, alternately semicircular and rectangular, supported the upper story of a hard Egyptian rock called porphyry, on which rests the gigantic cupola of stratified concrete, a masterpiece of Roman architecture. A perfect hemisphere 142 feet in diameter and as high again as the entire construction, it is certainly the widest ever constructed, and its masonry is composed of volcanic ash and pebble to reduce its mass. At its center is an aperture nearly 30 feet in diameter, which furnishes the light for the interior. Here we discover the Foro Boario, with the temple attributed to Parthenos and the seat of government of Annona, upon which was built in the 7th century the church of Santa Maria in Cosmedin, whose interior is decorated with impressive works of art with its tall Romanesque bell tower. Below, in its porch, there is a circular hole in the wall, sculptured in Roman marble-like stone, representing the mask of a sea divinity. It is called La Bocca della Verità, the mouth of the truth, for legend has it that an erring wife under suspicion of deceiving her husband had her hand bitten off when interrogated here. The Appian Way was constructed 300 years before Christ by the consul Appio Claudio the Blind One and stretched as far as Capua. It was considered the most famous of the Roman roads for its width and its beauty and was called the Queen of Roads, Regina Viarum, by the poet Stazio in the 1st century AD. It was paved with flagstones of volcanic rock from the Lazio hills, and for long stretches there were well-kept footpaths. On either side stood the tombs of citizens. The tombs were of every conceivable shape and size, often covered with carvings and moldings and portraits. Along the Via Appia we find the catacombs of San Sebastiano, which testify to the glorious period in the church's history of martyrs. In the church, the marmoreal sculpture of the Holy Martyr. While the Roman Empire was at the height of its splendor, little by little, and at first in secret, Christianity in Rome was born and began to develop. To recapture once again the atmosphere of that period, it's enough to descend into the long and intricate subterranean galleries of the catacombs. While still on the Via Appia, we can find the catacombs of San Callisto, dug out of the volcanic rock, where the first Christians buried their dead. To facilitate the visits of the faithful to the more revered tombs, small rooms were realized, as is the case of the crypt of Santa Cecilia, which today is decorated with a copy of the famous statue by the 16th century sculptor Stefano Maderno. The tombs, hollowed out of the walls of the galleries and crypts, were sealed sometimes with slabs of marble, inscribed upon with the name of the deceased, and often with symbolic recognition. The paintings in the catacombs are inspired by the Old and the New Testaments. Jesus is often represented as the Good Shepherd leading home his lost sheep. The model of Constantine's Rome gives us a complete picture of pagan Rome. From that period began the change in the appearance of the buildings of a Christian Rome, which changed its whole character. When the Emperor Hadrian gave orders for the construction of his mausoleum and the bridge, which was designed to be its grandiose triumphal entrance, he could not have imagined the turn of events that would shape its destiny to become the strongest fortress in the whole of Rome. From medieval times, it was transformed into a castle in gratitude for the divine pardon which put an end to a terrible pestilence, in the form of an angel who appeared at its tower with a flaming sword. The angel who, according to legend, performed this symbolic act was Sant'Angelo, from which the castle took its name. At a distance of only a few hundred yards, the atmosphere changes to one of bustle and noise. Piazza Campo dei Fiori, with its teeming market stalls. At the center of all the confusion and noise rises the statue of Giordano Bruno on its tall plinth. It was here in February 1600 that he was burnt at the stake as a heretic, for his ideas were considered too advanced for his times. During the first centuries AD, the area around the Via della Conciliazione consisted of a quiet sepulchral road flanked by humble mausoleums, for the most part pagan. And where the basilica stands today was the Circo di Caligula and Nerone, and there a small space with a poor little tomb in the earth where lay buried a man condemned to death by the most infamous of capital punishments, crucifixion on a cross. It was the tomb of the Apostle Peter, and in the 4th century, Constantine constructed a sumptuous basilica over that spot, which lies today right under the cupola of St. Peter's, which was rebuilt from the 1500s by the greatest architects of the Renaissance and Baroque eras. Vatican City, seat of the pontiff, is one of the smallest sovereign states in the world. Yet in its territory of just a few acres, it houses one of the greatest art collections in the world of untold value. Its own security and police force are under the command of the Swiss Guards, founded in 1506. Still today, they wear the elegant multicolored uniforms, which were designed, it is said, by Michelangelo, to whose genius we owe the miracle of St. Peter's cupola. High up at a window in the pontiff's palace, His Holiness presents himself on Sundays and feast days to address the crowds below who fill the square and to give his benediction. The ancient Egyptian obelisk at the center of the square was put there in 1586 by Domenico Fontana at the wish of Pope Sixtus V. At the summit of the basilica's frontage, amongst the statues of the apostles by Salvatore and San Giovanni Battista, 2 elegant clocks by Valadier stand out. They have told the pilgrims below the hour for the last 200 years. The interior of the basilica is simply a succession of masterpieces, one following the other. And we should like to pause before a work of art that can never be repeated, a miracle of the human genius which does not cease to amaze over the centuries, La Pietà of Michelangelo. Sculptured at the age of 25, it is pervaded by a strong symbolism. The body of Christ, quite perfect anatomically, and with no other signs of his martyrdom than the wounds from the nails of his crucifixion, lies completely abandoned in the arms of his mother. The sublime countenance of the Madonna, as ever very young in spite of age, suffused with the infinite purity of she who has never known sin, inclines over the lifeless body of Christ as though to clasp to her bosom her beloved Son, and symbolically all of suffering humanity. In the immensity of her grief, Mary would seem to open her arms in acceptance of divine will. The Sistine Chapel was constructed under Sixtus IV to serve the double function of pontifical chapel and a fortified shelter in time of need. The Pope had its walls frescoed by the greatest painters of the Renaissance. The ceiling of the chapel originally depicted a blue sky sprinkled with golden stars. Pope Julius II, at the beginning of the 16th century, wished to have the ceiling repainted with the 12 apostles. In spite of having at his disposition many famous painters, he turned to Michelangelo with what we might consider inspired intuition. The Basilica of San Giovanni in Laterano, called the Cathedral of Rome, was built in the 4th century and afterwards was rebuilt and altered. Today we can admire the majestic frontage which Alessandro Algardi designed at the beginning of the 18th century. The Basilica of San Paolo, since the 4th century, rises above the tomb of the apostle. In 1823 it was gutted by fire and afterwards was rebuilt as we can see it today, with its frontage adorned in rich mosaics representing 4 prophets, the Lamb of God, symbol of Christ on the hillside from which 4 streams pour out. The church of San Pietro in Vincoli is rich in works of art, but it is famous for the chains of St. Peter, as well as for the mausoleum of Pope Julius II by Michelangelo. Michelangelo's genius is also displayed in his superb statue of Moses with the Ten Commandments upon his descent from Mount Sinai, angry with his people for their worship of the golden calf. To one side of Piazza del Popolo is the Pincio, the fascinating public gardens planned by Valadier that still preserve an enchanting water clock on an island. Piazza Navona, a harmonious, ample space, scanned by spectacular fountains and closed in by high palatial houses. They follow exactly the shape of the Domiziano Stadium upon whose ruins they sit today. Facing the church of Sant'Agnese, the Christian girl who was martyred in this very stadium, we cannot fail to be struck by the fountain of the great Four Rivers of Gian Lorenzo Bernini in 1651. A reef of rocks supports at its center a Roman obelisk that was previously in the Circo di Masenzio on the Appian Way. From a grotto among the sculptured rocks emerges a lion and other imaginative animals, while there are seated the personifications of the Nile, the Ganges, the Danube, and the River Plate from the four corners of the then known world, Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas. And this is the queen of the fountains of Rome, the world-famous Fontana di Trevi, which in its capricious 18th century style of Nicola Salvi would seem to have been inspired by Bernini. In an animated theatrical scene of water coursing over rocks, towers the figure of Neptune in a chariot, drawn by two seahorses driven by sea god. Everybody would seem to believe in the charming custom of throwing a coin over one's shoulder into the fountain to ensure one's return. Via dei Condotti. Then we find ourselves in that multiform, picturesque and romantic space that is Piazza di Spagna, with its theatrical flight of steps from the 18th century Francesco di Sandis, leading to the church of Trinita dei Monti. In the center of the piazza, the Fontana della Barcaccia, the old boat, by Bernini's father Pietro, records an actual embarkation from this very point during the disastrous flooding of the Tevere in 1598. In the very center of Rome today, we can still find a peaceful corner in the Emperor Augustus Mausoleum. Its circular base stands upon a tomb of earth planted with cypress trees. It can be found in the center of Piazza Augusto Imperatore, next to the Arapaces and some splendid churches, in one of the most suggestive parts of this city.
Perfectly harmonious image, Florence spreads over the valleys surrounded by gently rolling hills. The vineyards, the olive groves, the quiet bourgeois villas are dotted over a setting which has never been natural, but has always been civilized by the work of man. Usually the air is clear and bright, but when, as Hawthorne remarked, a light mist rises from the valley, the fog takes Florence beyond the limits of reality, making it appear quite perfect. It is just as if you were dreaming of the valley, and the valley itself were dreaming too, and had met you halfway through the dream. According to an ancient Greek inscription, this is how Florence became that place that cares for your soul. Here, In the center of this place, like a material and spiritual keystone, towers the Great Dome by Brunelleschi. In order to complete the cathedral with a 45-meter diameter dome, Filippo Brunelleschi invented a new technique that enabled the dome to hold itself up during work. This consisted of two concentric coverings made of herringboned bricks, so that they were self-supporting. Outside, the structural design of the dome has touches of color in the contrast between the red of the dome vaults and the white of the mighty marble ribbing. The dome was completed in 1436, and in the same year, Pope Eugene IV was finally able to consecrate the new cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore. And just like a flower in bloom on its stem, the great sculptor and architect Arnolfo di Cambio had designed the church which was to replace Saint Reparata at the end of the 13th century. The cathedral, in fact, is a longitudinal building with naves and aisles which flow into a spectacular octagonal apse with chapels running off diagonally. We are in the part of the city which is particularly imbued with memories of Dante, from the Torre della Castagna, Tower of the Chestnut, the first residence of the priors of the guilds, to the house of the Alighieris, where Dante was said to have been born in 1265. Dante certainly knew the first little modest Franciscan church of Santa Croce, and in 1295 saw the foundation of the magnificent new cathedral that was said to have been designed by Arnolfo di Cambio. Piazza Santa Croce, lined by noble palaces, soon became the favorite place for preaching, burning heretics, and holding jousting, fairs, and tournaments. From the 16th century, during Carnival period, football matches began between the teams of the four traditional districts of the city, thus creating the famous football in traditional costume. The rules of the game, a blend of modern football, wrestling, and rugby, are quite simple and consist of having to throw the ball or kick it into a net running right across the two shorter sides of the square. The origins of this game date back to Roman times, but the most important match which inspired the historic revival of football in traditional costume was the one played in Piazza Santa Croce on February the 17th, 1530, during the long siege by Charles V's imperial troops. This was a challenge not only between the teams in the square, but also against the besiegers, in order to show them proudly that Florence still possessed the spirit and energy to enjoy itself. Besides the actual competition, the most spectacular features of today's event are due to the sumptuous historic pageant, which consists of over 530 people, dressed in the exact costumes of the times, and depicting the participants at the famous 16th century match. Continuing along the River Arno, we reach one of the most typical parts of the city, with 14th century houses and towers which belong to the greatest feudal families. The buildings in this area only give a vague idea of what must have been the city atmosphere up to the end of the 13th century. Then, in fact, the 150 noble towers which filled the Florence skyline were demolished in the furious fighting between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. In this area there is also the beautiful Palazzo d'Avanzati, a grand vertical 14th century building whose interiors were skillfully restored by the antique dealer Volpi at the beginning of this century. With its courtyard, stairways, the well that supplied water to all the floors, rooms frescoed with drapes and gardens, fireplaces and comforts with priceless decor, this building can well be used as the museum of the old Florentine house. Among its sumptuous rooms, one of the most outstanding is the Sala dei Pappagalli, Room of the Parrots, so called because of the birds decorating both the upholstery and walls, a typical example of a 14th century merchant's upper middle class residence. The building of the Mercato Nuovo, New Market, was part of Cosimo I's plans regarding the new layout of the town. He moved into Palazzo Vecchio in 1540. This triggered off a whole series of impressive works, which, however, did not alter the external appearance of the building designed by Arnolfo of Cambio. Those protective walls, witnessing so many great things, as Vasari wrote. In 1559, Vasari began building the Uffizi as the new seat of the 13 magistracies that were by then all in the power of the Medicis. In 1591, the loggia which completed the structure became a museum, and so the famous Uffizi Gallery was established. From the Room of the Primitives, completely rebuilt by Michelucci and Scarpa, to the vast collection of self-portraits in the Vasarian corridor, the gallery has been extended over the centuries until it occupied the whole building in order to hold the widest possible range of Italian art. The Ognissanti Madonna and the Badia triptych are sufficient evidence to show all the power of Giotto's art that was aimed at a new sense of reality and already able to conceive three-dimensional space. In the renowned paintings of The Birth of Venus and Spring, you can admire Botticelli's extremely stylistic clarity with delicate flowing lines, refined color combination, and the superb purity of his nudes, which are never pagan. The complex allegories executed by this tormented 15th century artist do not prevent us from enjoying spiritual and not physical beauty to the full. These two works are completely dominated by deep melancholy inspiration. In the Baptism of Christ by Verrocchio, the first artistic attempts by an adolescent Leonardo can be recognized, and the complex relationship between a human story and nature, which are depicted in the unfinished Adoration of the Magi, show all the innovative force of his art. The octagonal-shaped tribuna by Buontalenti can be seen instead as a blend of both art and nature. The vault is encrusted with shells, and the color was inspired by the four alchemistic elements of earth, air, water, and fire. 16th century painting is represented by its greatest masters, from Raphael's later-day portrait of Pope Leo X and the Madonna del Cardellino, Goldfinch, a perfect family composition brought to life by curves and harmonic counterpoints, to the Madonna delle Arpie, masterpiece by the infallible painter Andrea del Sarto, who is himself immortalized in the figure of St. John the Baptist. And finally, Titian, whose Venus of Urbino vibrates with intense vitality, exalted by a soft chiaroscuro plasticism. Opulent and fascinating feminine beauty, which can also be seen in the later work, Venus and Cupid, painted with the same strong, warm, and sensual colors. In 1564, the architect of the Uffizi built in only 5 months the original Vasarian corridor, which connects the Palazzo della Signoria with Palazzo Pitti, leading over the goldsmiths' shops on the Ponte Vecchio, the oldest bridge in the city. Near the church of San Lorenzo and the palace of Via Larga stands another religious building which was favored by and benefited from the Medicis, San Marco. It was Cosimo the Elder who commissioned Michelozzo to completely reconstruct the building, chosen previously as a spiritual retreat and for meditation. The great severity of Michelozzo's architecture can be admired in the bright and serene inner cloisters, corresponding perfectly to the painting by Beato Angelico, on show in the ground floor rooms. In the library, Michelozzo achieved an admirable effect of aerial space, consisting only of lines and light. In the corridors of the monastery there are still a number of brilliant frescoes by Beato Angelico, like, for example, the Annunciazione, the Annunciation, where the apparent formal ingeniousness conceals a profound affinity to Brunelleschi's perspective, but suffused with complete abandon to the divine. Still in St. Mark's Square stands the Academy Gallery, containing a 19th century rotunda, which was expressly built to house Michelangelo's David. Sculptured by the artist when he was still very young, the huge figure of David was placed in front of the Palazzo Vecchio in 1504, as a symbol of the Florentine Republic's unshakable love for freedom. In order to express all the energy of the young hero, Michelangelo depicted David not after the victory, but just when he was going to throw the stone with his sling. In the beautiful, finely muscled limbs, we are aware of both strength and tension, while the frowning face is seen in profile, and the expression shows the strongest of wills ever to have been expressed while fighting the enemy. The architect Giuseppe Poggi was responsible for the complete restructure of the city when Florence became the capital. Piazza della Repubblica was built to replace the old Mercato Vecchio and the ghetto. Poggi was also responsible for creating the Parco delle Cascine, one of the favorite places for Florentine family Sunday outings. The lawns in the park have an unusual aspect, owing to the combination of the Medici layout with the Lorraine arboreal modifications, plus further work by Napoleon. The park lies on the Arno, the river whose course and history have marked the destiny of Florence. The old name of Florentia, derived from the city's position on the confluence of the Mugnone and Arno rivers. The Romans founded a colony here, only because they were skilled enough to control the watercourses. Therefore, the city was founded thanks to man's intelligent reply to the challenge of nature. A challenge which has never ended, as the flood on November 6, 1966, was the 60th since the one in 1177, which was the first to be historically recorded and was the most disastrous of all.
Only one piazza, St. Mark's, which is made up of 4 distinct areas: the Piazzetta dei Leoni, the Molo, the Piazzetta, and the Piazza. It is the traditional entrance to the city, a meeting point between East and West. It has been described as one of the most beautiful parlors in the world. But most important of all, it is the heart and head of the city. The heart because it hosts the basilica devoted to its patron saint, whose body it harbors, and which, due to the religious beliefs of the city's ancient founders, motivated the city to proclaim its independence. The head because the Palazzo Ducale was the seat of each magistracy, each formed by men of equal rights who gave Venice, before and better than any other state, permanent order, thereby guaranteeing its political independence. The Venetian state was a sovereign state, unique in medieval times, where each magistrate, including the Doge, had to abide strictly by the laws and only by the laws. The Great Council was the ruling authority. At one time, it had its members elected by a citizens' assembly. This was succeeded by admittance by hereditary rights, thereby forming a patrician state, which was justified by the rich being less susceptible to corruption, yet more willing to sacrifice their free time and sustain the responsibilities which naturally tallied with the career of a public official. The Venetian Constitution, which was later to be studied and taken as an example by Benjamin Franklin and by the fathers of the American Constitution, protected the common people from any fault, so that patricians and plebeians supported each other for the common good. This bay, once considered the port of Venice, marks the embarkment of fleets in conquest of the Adriatic, and later of the Levantine markets, where the Serenissima held an economic and military position for many years, leaving evident traces in the architecture and the dialects of the entire stretch of the eastern Mediterranean coast. Marco Polo also set out from this point, his enterprising spirit leading him to attempt the conquest of lands, not only unheard of at the time, but which were not even imagined. This is the entrance to the arsenal, where the Venetian fleets were built and restored. An agglomeration of industries, each accomplishing quite singular activities, though complementary: shipbuilding, weapon manufacture, and rope manufacture. It was founded in the 12th century and continuously expanded, reaching its peak in the 16th century, when it gave employment to as many as 16,000 workers. Protected by high and powerful walls, its activities, subject to the utmost secrecy, were carried out by highly skilled craftsmen who passed down their vocations from father to son, so as to ensure the reliability of the Venetian fleet, which remains mythical. The government supervised working relationships between owners and workers. For example, it forbade admission to the crafts to youngsters under the age of 12. It introduced dismissal notice, it enforced the observance of a Sunday rest, and it generally forbade night work. The workers formed congregations according to their skills, which served both a religious and professional purpose. They thus formed schools, which were meeting places for religious practice and social events. The gondola is the most typical lagoon boat, today practically an emblem of the city. Like the Sandolo, the Caorlina, the Topa and other small boats, it boasts particular characteristics. The flat bottom is essential for going out by low tide and to avoid grounding in dubious canals. The hull, which is curved and unsymmetrical, is skillfully built so as to balance the strokes of the single oar. These boats are rowed standing for a better visibility, and so that the oar can be easily handled in narrow spaces. Accustomed as one may be to Venice, one cannot but marvel at the view of the Canal Grande as it widely unravels into the basin of St. Mark's, perhaps the most majestic, definitely the most suggestive course in the world, never repetitive in its beauty, drawn as it is in a conspiracy of light and water. At the entrance, the green dome of San Simeon Piccolo and the silver dome of Madonna della Salute. Palaces along each side of the banks, some boasting gleaming walls of multicolored marble, others pale and faintly tracing frescoes, changing tone to the fancy of light. Recalling each era by their varying style, and all abounding in their fanciful casement windows, reflecting the water below, and which in turn are gracefully portrayed in the water, there is a harmony in their shape, bound as they are by the need and obligation to observe identical spaces and weights during construction. But what particularly unites these palaces, enhancing the characteristic of each, is the light, master of the scenery, penetrating the calli and the banks, brightening the gardens, teasing the facades of the palaces by giving them colors which it immediately exchanges in favor of others in a continuous crescendo of perfection. ancient classically Venetian performances, which as in the past still arouse great curiosity and amazement, are the regattas. It seems that their original purpose was as a sort of challenge between the large boats. Over the years, the gondoliers have become champions of this sport. There are, however, non-competitive rowing competitions, like the one you see here, where admission is allowed to all kinds of boats with varying crew numbers, each with an individual category. All the Venetians participate and contribute in making it a thoroughly attractive and enjoyable performance. This is one of the tallest bell towers in Venice, belonging to the monumental block of the Frari. The church, the convent, and the marvelous cloisters annexed are not only important because of their architectural aspect, but also for the beauty of the masterpieces they safeguard, and for the presence of the Historical State Archives, containing documents of the Venetian institution and civilization. Campo Santa Maria Formosa, which is surrounded by various palaces bearing Veneto, Byzantine and Gothic features of the 13th and 14th centuries, used to be an open-air theatre for cazzie or bullfights and other characteristic performances. Santa Maria dei Miracoli is a jewel of the Renaissance, set in a narrow gap which, yet, enhances its beauty. It is completely covered with a precious marble, arranged creatively to form decorative and architectural motifs. The mighty church of Santi Giovanni and Paolo, abbreviated by the Venetians into San Zanipolo, a temple of the Dominicans, who erected it between the 13th and the 15th centuries, harbors the tombs of many of the doges who were buried there, and whose funerals it celebrated. In the middle of the wide court is Verrocchio's splendid equestrian statue, possibly the most beautiful in the world, representing the great captain Bartolomeo Colleoni on his horse at the Venetians' service. We have now arrived in the popular Castello quarter, or rather Sestiere, considering that the city is divided into 6 parts, called sestieri, each represented by a line on the iron symbol which is on the bow of the gondola. Together with Rialto, Castello was the first nucleus to settle, fortified as its name signifies. The church of San Piero, until 1807, held the status of cathedral, Church of Venice, San Marco being at the time the Doge's chapel. The unhealthy, cramped living quarters in the populous areas led the Venetians to carry out their working activities in the open during the hot months. Here in Castello, where tradition is still strong, daily activities seem to follow the same pattern as centuries before.